This is a read aloud of Berry by Langston Hughes. When the boy arrived on the 4 o'clock train, lo and behold, he turned out to be coloured. Mrs. Osborne saw him the minute he got out of the station wagon. But certainly there was nothing to be done about it that night, with no trains back to the city before morning. So she set him to washing dishes. Lord knows there were a plenty. The Scandinavian kitchen boy had left right after breakfast, giving no notice, leaving her and the cook to do everything. Her wire to the employment office in Jersey City brought results, but dark ones. The card said his name was Milbury Jones. Well, where was he to sleep? Heretofore, the kitchen boy and the handyman gardener chauffeur shared the same quarters, but Mrs. Osborne had no idea how the handyman might like Negroes. Help were so touchy, and it was hard keeping good servants in the country. So, right after dinner, leaving Milbury and his arms in the dishwater, Mrs. Osborne made a beeline across the side lawn for Dr. Renfield's cottage. She heard the kids laughing and playing on the big screened-in front porch of the sanitarium. She heard one of the nurses say to a child, "Behave, Billy," as she went across the yard under the pine and maple trees. Mrs. Osborne hoped Dr. Renfield would be on his porch. She hated to knock at the door and perhaps be faced with his wife. The gossip among the nurses and help at Dr. Renfield's summer home for crippled children had it that Mrs. Osborne was in love with Dr. Renfield, that she just worshipped him, that she followed him with her eyes every chance she got, and not only with her eyes. Of course, there wasn't a word of truth in it, Mrs. Osborne said to herself, admitting at the same time that Martha Renfield, his wife, was certainly not good enough for the doctor. Anyway, tonight she was not bound on any frivolous errand towards the doctor's cottage. She had to see him about the Negro in their midst. At least, they'd have to keep him there overnight or until they got somebody else to help in the kitchen. However, he looked like a decent boy. Dr. Renfield was not at home. His wife came to the door, spoke most coldly, and said that she presumed, as usual, the doctor would make his rounds at the home at 8. She hoped Mrs. Osborne could wait until then to see him. Good evening. Mrs. Osborne went back across the dusk-dark yard. She heard the surf rushing at the beach below and saw the young moon rising. She thought maybe the doctor was walking along the sea in the twilight alone. Ah, Dr. Renfield, Dr. Wren. When he made the usual rounds at 8, he came, for a moment, by Mrs. Osborne's little office where the housekeeper held forth over her linens and her accounts. He turned his young but bearded face towards Mrs. Osborne, cast his great dark eyes upon her, and said, "I hear you've asked to see me." "Yes, indeed, Dr. Renfield," Mrs. Osborne bubbled and gurgled. "We have a problem on our hands. You know the kitchen man left this morning, so I sent a wire to the high-class help agency in the city for somebody right away by the 4 o'clock train, and they sent us a Negro. He seems to be a nice boy and all that, but I just don't know how he would fit in our home. Now, what do you think?" The doctor looked at her with great seriousness. He thought, then he answered with a question. "Do the other servants mind?" "Well, I can't say they do. They got along all right tonight during dinner, but the problem is, where would he sleep? Oh, yes, said Dr. Renfield, pursing his lips. And whether we should plan to keep him all summer or just till we get someone else. I say, said the Dr. Renfield, and again he thought. You say he can do the work. How about the attic in this building? It's not in use. And by the way, how much did we pay the other fellow? $10 a week, said Mrs. Osborne, raising her eyes. Well, pay the darky 8, said Dr. Renfield, and keep him. And for a moment, he gazed deep into Mrs. Osborne's eyes. Good night. Then turned and left her. So it was that Milbury entered into service at Dr. Renfield's summer home for crippled children. Milbury was a nice black boy, big, good-natured, and strong, like what Paul Robeson must have been at 20, except that he wasn't educated. He was from Georgia, where they don't have many schools for Negroes, and he hadn't been north long. He was glad to have a job, even if it was at a home for crippled children way out in the country on a beach 5 miles from the nearest railroad. Milbury had been hungry for weeks in Newark and Jersey City. He needed work and food. And even if he wasn't educated, he had plenty of mother wit and lots of intuition about people and places. It didn't take him long to realize that he was doing far too much work for the home's $8 a week, and that everybody was imposing on him in that taken-for-granted way white folks do with Negro help. Milbury got up at 5:30 in the mornings, made the fire for the cook, set the water to boiling for the head nurse's coffee, started peeling potatoes, onions, and apples. After breakfast, he washed up all the dishes, scoured the pots and pans, scrubbed the floors, and carried in wood for the fireplace in the front room, which really wasn't his job at all, but the handymans who had put it off on Milbury. The waitresses, too, got in the habit of asking him to polish their silver and ice their water, and Mrs. Osborne always had something extra that needed to be done. Not kitchen boy work, a cellar to be cleaned out, or the linen in her closet reshelved, or the dining room windows washed. Milbury knew they took him for a workhorse, a fool, and a nigger. Still, he did everything and didn't look mad. Jobs were too hard to get, and he had been hungry too long in town. Besides, Milbury said to himself, the ways of white folks. I mean, some white folks is too much for me. I reckon there must be a few good ones, but most of 'em ain't good. Leastwise, they don't treat me good, and Lord knows I ain't never done nothing to 'em, nothing at all. But at the home, it wasn't the work that really troubled him, or the fact that nobody ever said anything about a day's off or a little extra pay. No, he had had many jobs like this one before, where they worked you to death. But what really worried Milbury at this place was that he seemed to sense something wrong, something phony about the whole house, except the little crippled kids there like himself, because they couldn't help it. Maybe it was the lonesomeness of that part of the Jersey coast, with its pines and scrubs and sand. But more nearly, Milbury thought it was that there doctor with the movie beard and the woman's eyes at the head of the home. And it was the cranky nurses always complaining about food and the little brats under them, and the constant talk of who was having an affair with Dr. Renfield, and Mrs. Osborne's grand manner to everybody but the doctor, and all the white help kicking about their pay, and how far it was from town, and how no good the doctor was, or the head nurse, or the cook, or Mrs. Osborne.
It's sure funny, this here place, Milbury said to himself. Funny how the food ain't nearly so good except when some ma or pa or some child is visiting here. Then, when they're gone, it drops right back down again. This here hangout is just Doc Renfield's own private jeep game. Poor little children.
The Negro was right. The summer home was run for profits from the care of permanently deformed children of middle-class parents who couldn't afford to pay too much, but who still paid well, too well, for what their children got in return. Milbury worked in the kitchen and saw the good cans opened for company and the cheap cans opened for the kids. Somehow, he didn't like such dishonesty. Somehow, he thought he wouldn't even stay there and work if it wasn't for the kids. For the children grew terribly to like Milbury. One afternoon, during his short period of rest between meals, he had walked down to the beach where those youngsters who could drag themselves about were playing, and the others were sitting in their wheelchairs watching. The sky was only a little cloudy, and the sand was grey. But quite all of a sudden, it began to rain. The nurses saw Milbury and called him to help them get the young ones quickly back to the house. Some of the children were too heavy for a nurse to lift easily into a wheelchair. Some couldn't run at all. The handyman helper wasn't around. So Milbury picked up child after child, sometimes two at once, and carried them up to the broad screened-in porch of the home. The children loved it, riding on his broad back or riding in his arms in the soft, gentle rain. "Come and play with us sometimes," one of them called as Milbury left them all on the safe, dry porch with their nurses. "Sure, come back and play," another said. So Milbury, the next day, went down to the beach again in the afternoon and played with the crippled children. At first, the nurses, Miss Baxter and Mrs. Hill, didn't know whether to let him stay or not, but their charges seemed to enjoy it. Then, when the time came to go in for rest before dinner, Milbury helped push the wheelchairs, a task which the nurses hated, and he held the hands of those kids with braces and twisted limbs as they hobbled along. He told them stories, and he made up jokes in the sun on the beach, and one rainy afternoon on the porch, he sang songs, old Southern Negro songs, funny ones that the children loved. Almost every afternoon then, Milbury came to the beach after the luncheon dishes were done, and he had washed himself, except those afternoons when Mrs. Osborne found something else for him to do. Vases to be emptied or bathtubs scoured. The children became Milbury's friends. They adored him, and he them. They called him Berry. They put their arms about him. The grown-up white folks only spoke to him when they had some job for him to do, or when they were kidding him about being dark and talking flat and southern and mispronouncing words. But the kids didn't care how he talked. They loved his songs and his stories. And He made up stories out of his own head just for them. Poor little crippled up things that they were, for Barry loved them too. So the summer wore on. August came. In September, the home would close, but disaster overtook Milbury before then. At the end of August, a week of rain fell, and the children could not leave the porch. Then, one afternoon, the sun suddenly came out bright and warm. The sea water was blue again, and the sand on the beach glistened. Miss Baxter, who by now had got the idea it was part of Milbury's job to help her with the children, went to the kitchen and called him while he was still washing lunch and dishes. "Barry, we're going to take the children down to the beach. Come and help us with the chairs as soon as you get through."
"Yes, ma'am," said Barry.
When he came out on the porch, the children were all excited about playing in the sun once more. Little hunchbacks jumped and cried and clapped their hands, and little paralytics laughed in their wheelchairs, and some with braces on had already hobbled out the screen door and were gathered on the walk. "Hello, Barry," the children called. "Hey, Barry," they cried to the black boy. Barry grinned. It was a few hundred yards to the beach. On the cement walk, you could push a couple of wheelchairs at a time to the sand's edge. Some of the children propelled their own. Besides the nurses, today the handyman was helping, for the sun might not last long. "Take me," a little boy called from his wheelchair. "Barry, take me."
"Sure, I will,"
the young Negro said gently. But when Barry started to push the chair down from the porch to the walk, the child, through excess of joy, suddenly leaned forward, laughing, and suddenly lost his balance. Barry saw that he was going to fall. To try to catch the boy, the young Negro let the chair go, but, quick as a wink, the child had fallen one way onto the lawn, the chair the other onto the cement walk. The back of the chair was broken, snapped off, except for the wicker. The little boy lay squalling on the ground in the grass. "Lord, have mercy!" All the nurses came running, the handyman and Mrs. Osborne too. Barry picked up the little boy, who clung to his neck, sobbing, more frightened it seemed than hurt.
"Poor little child," Barry kept saying. "Is you hurt much? I's so sorry." But the nurses were very angry, for they were responsible. And Mrs. Osborne? Well, she lit out for Dr. Renfield. The little boy still clung to Barry and wouldn't let the nurses take him at all. He had stopped crying when Dr. Renfield arrived, but was still sniffling. He had his arms tight around the black boy's neck. "Give the child to me," Dr. Renfield said, his brown beard pointing straight at Barry, his mind visualizing irate parents and a big damaged suit and bad publicity for the home. But when the doctor tried to take the child, the little boy wriggled and cried and wouldn't let go of Barry. With what strength he had in his crooked brace limbs, he kicked at the doctor. "Give me that child," Dr. Renfield shouted at Barry. "Bring him into my office and lay him down." He put on his nose glasses. "You careless black rascal! And you, Miss Baxter?" The doctor shriveled her with a look. "I want to see you." In the clinic, it turned out that the child wasn't really hurt, though. His legs had been, from birth, twisted and deformed. Nothing could injure them much further, and, fortunately, his spine wasn't weak. But the doctor kept saying, "Criminal carelessness! Criminal carelessness!" Mrs. Osborne kept agreeing with him. "Yes, it is. Indeed it is." Milbury was to blame. The black boy felt terrible, but nobody else among the grown-ups seemed to care how he felt. They all said, What dumbness! He had let that child fall. Get rid of him, Dr. Renfield said to the housekeeper. Today, the fool nigger, and deduct $10 for that broken chair. We don't pay him but $8, Mrs. Osborne said. Well, deduct that, said the doctor. So, without his last week's wages, Milbury went to Jersey City. The end.